The haunting tales of dark Shivering. Dark Shivering is a village lost on the border of England and Wales. Hidden between two countries, claimed by neither, and heeded by both. I've collected old stories passed down through generations which have been considered fairy stories. But when the wind groans, and the trees creak, and the man in your closet stares at you, you know there are no fairy tales here. The half-hanged monk of Golden Gables. Golden Gables is a large forbidding manor house that sits at the top of Mason Hill. It overlooks the village of Dark Shivering and is now a privately owned residence. I was lucky enough to be invited to have a look around the property when the current owner did an extensive refurbishment in the early 1990s. I was staying in the local inn as was my usual custom and came into a conversation with a chap who I hadn't met before, called John James. He was all too welcoming when it came to his home and its history. It had served as a monastery until 1975, when the dwindling number of monks in service there made it unfeasible to carry on living in such a large residence. They packed up their things, sold Golden Gables and moved over the border into North Wales. The house boasts over 30 rooms and still has the original tennis courts and pool house at the rear. The only modern addition is a glass orangery which runs the whole length of the house. This is, however, a faithful recreation of one that once stood in the very same spot, but had fallen into disrepair some years earlier. The house is now awash with beautiful carved wood, warm luxurious soft furnishings and a family who have made it their home. I decided on my next business trip to Dark Shivering I would take Mr. James up on his offer and enjoy a visit and tour of his property. It had certainly piqued my interest each time I spotted its turreted roof peeking through the trees from the road below. I passed it on many occasions to get in and out of the village. The day was sunny, everything was lush and green with summer flowers swaying in the breeze as I pulled my car off the road and headed up the lonely driveway. John James would not be there to show me around, unfortunately. He had been called away most urgently to his lifelong friend who was very poorly in Ireland. It was possibly to my benefit, however, as I felt he was a disbeliever of any and all ghosts and ghoulies, and instead I had a simply marvelous tour with Mr. James's father, Geoffrey. Geoffrey was a very old and interesting man who accompanied me around the grounds and spoke knowledgeably on its dark history. We sat amongst the willow trees in the garden and I enjoyed the sun on my face as he spoke. He told me that the manor had been built to house monks and junior nuns who schooled boys from the local area. Golden Gables was overseen by a despicable old monk called Brother Michael. Brother Michael had long lost his religious path and instead followed one of intolerable abuse and cruelty. Many junior nuns were taken advantage of, the boys were beaten unfairly and regularly, and countless monks refused to be housed there. His vile reign over Golden Gables spanned more than 30 years and was only brought to an end in the early 1800s by a particularly cruel punishment he handed out to one of his pupils. The boy was beaten, locked in the cellar, and told to repent for his sins. What was his sin? He had stopped to help one of his superiors pick up some fallen papers, making him late to Brother Michael's lesson. The boy paid dearly, as when he was found he was close to death and in fact died in the following days from his injuries. The people of the village were in uproar over the murderous monk, and a court quickly found him guilty and sentenced him to hang by his neck until he was dead. This may have been the end of the story had it not been for the rope breaking when the monk was falling to his death. Everyone knew the rule of the rope, and Sir Brother Michael walked away from the hangman that day smiling, but he wouldn't be smiling for long, as an angry crowd followed him that night and made sure he paid his penance. After that, Brother Michael was never seen again, until that is, 1977, when Golden Gables was undergoing some repair work. The skeleton of a man was found in a hidden room beneath the back stairs. What is most incredible about this story is that there hadn't been much attempt to hide this body at all. It was simply left in a long-forgotten room, accessed only by a wooden paneled door with no handle under the stairs. This would lead to the obvious conclusion that all previous occupants of the house knew he was there. It was whilst having tea in the kitchen on my visit that I was privy to the rumored ghost stories of Golden Gables. Geoffrey had spotted a rather unfortunate-looking sheep stuck with its woolly breeches amongst the brambles of the hedge. He said it belonged to the farm next door, and he would go and let the farmer know one of his girls was stuck. I was left in the capable hands of my host's wife, who had just brewed the tea and was delighted to be sharing her tales with me and a friend who happened to be staying for the week. Mrs. James stopped polishing her cutlery whilst she chatted and came and sat with us by the large warm range. We were both eager to hear what she had to say and both sat with wide eyes waiting for her to begin. Her ghost story started with the usual occurrence of strange knockings, doors opening and cold spots around the house. The usual type of things that people complain about to begin with. She seemed as though these things didn't bother her greatly, but went on to tell us of the things she did find terrifying and had almost made her move out. When she and her husband moved in the late 80s, she had been told the story of the half-hanged monk and how his bones had been uncovered inside the house. She had also been told that since his bones had been uncovered, his restless spirit liked to walk the manor and had often been seen with a menacing look on his face by the back staircase. It wasn't until a few guests came to her on separate occasions to say that someone had pushed them on the back stairs that she began to worry for people's safety, and about the nasty nature of this spirit that seemed to be making itself known. The house had two sets of stairs, both polar opposites in space. The back stairs was narrow and gloomy, whilst the main staircase was anything but. She herself had a particularly frightening experience when she was coming down the back stairs one evening to prepare supper. She was stood at the top of the steps when she looked down to see a hand hovering above one of the treads. This hand seemed to be free floating and grabbing at thin air. Suffice to say, she had a bad feeling come over her and knew that this hand was waiting to push her down the stairs. That was all the evidence she needed. She locked the doors at the top and bottom of the steps, and they have never been used since. The only access upstairs now is by the main staircase, which runs up through the center of the house. She said it wasn't long after this event that she saw this wretched soul, Brother Michael, twice in as many days. The first incidence was when she was getting dressed in her bedroom one winter morning. Mr. James had already left for work, and their bedroom was dimly lit by a few dull cracks of daylight seeping through the gaps in the heavy curtains. Mrs. James was stood dressing by her open wardrobe, and when she had finished she closed the mirrored door. To her horror, in the reflection of the very mirror she was stood by, she could see him standing behind her at the window. He was watching her with a mean stare. She quickly turned to face the window and look at him, but he had gone. Another look in the mirror, however, revealed him to still be there, and so she hitched her skirt up and ran out of the house screaming. Indeed, she stayed outside in the garden until her husband's return that afternoon. He was much impressed with how much gardening she had done that day, but not so impressed by her stories of hallucination. If that wasn't enough to send any sane person to the local asylum, the following day she was having an afternoon nap in the lounge, as she had quite rightly suffered a restless sleep the night before. After laying there for only a few moments, she awoke with a start, almost as though someone had poked her to wake up. The room had become chilled like an icebox, and she felt fear wash over her when she opened her eyes. She looked up to find the dark, shadowy figure of Brother Michael leaning over her with deep black eyes and an exhausted face. His skin was gray and his energy was dark. She closed her eyes quickly in terror and shouted at him to leave her alone. When she opened her eyes again, he had vanished, but she knew he was still there as the cold creeped around her shoulders. It's not surprising after this that she wanted to leave the house for good, but since those few ghastly instances she has seen nothing since. After frightening her friend and I with her stories, Mrs. James happily got back to her polishing. She had obviously had plenty of time to come to terms with her haunted house, but her good friend and I exchanged worried looks as first she realized she had to sleep in the place where a ghost was active, and I started to feel rather dubious about walking the very short distance back to my car alone. I bid good day to them both and thanked Mrs. James for a wonderful visit. She of course insisted that I return another day when her husband would be home, as he had been much aggrieved at missing my visit. I was only too pleased to agree to the invitation. However, as I stood in the porchway ready to turn my back on Golden Gables, a feeling of fear swept over my body, causing me to almost hop, skip and jump as fast as I could to my vehicle, all the while attempting a pleasant goodbye smile for my host, which unfortunately I'm sure was turning into a grimace. I was safely in my car and carefully pulling down the driveway when Jeffrey met me halfway down the exit. I told him I'd be back for another visit when John James was home. His raised eyebrow needed no explanation. I have a feeling most visitors don't come back. Dark Shivering has lots more stories to give up, and I'm always collecting them for future books. Join me next time for more haunting tales of Dark Shivering. Don't forget to click like and subscribe so you never miss another ghostly episode.